But anyway, Josh, it's wonderful to have you here. Josh is the new manager for Western Pennsylvania for CeaseFire. Rob Conroy's done other work, and Josh has stepped in. And so he's got a great story to tell, not only about his own personal journey, but about some work that we can do. So Josh, welcome. I think, please take it away. So
thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. Can you all see my opening slide here?
Yes.
yes.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, Vincent, and a shout out to Lori Swenson as well with the Gun Safety Committee. I had a chance to work with them as well. Diana, do I recognize you from the Gun Safety Committee as well? I thought I.
Oh no, I'm not. But I have heard you talk before, so I can't remember.
Okay.
When
I somehow know I've been on a Zoom before. I recognize you. But to everyone else who have not met yet, good morning. As Vincent said, my name is Josh Fleitman. I started as the new Western Pennsylvania manager for CeaseFire PA a little over a month ago, so I'm still relatively new. My predecessor was Rob Conroy. He was with CeaseFire for a decade here in Pittsburgh, so some of you may know him, and I'll be taking over his portfolio. And broadly, my work is to grow the capacity for gun violence prevention policy and programs throughout Western Pennsylvania. As a quick personal note, and I mentioned this to Vincent when him and I met individually, just as I was getting started. I myself was raised in the Jewish tradition, and you all may know a common Hebrew phrase, tikkun olam, which roughly translates to heal the world, and that has been the driving force behind my career. Prior to this, I worked in government for elected officials, most recently State Senator Pam Iovino, who represented a lot of the South Hills in Allegheny County. And that concept of tikkun olam, healing the world, is definitely something that animates my work in this new position. What more opportunity do we have to create healing than in the space of gun violence? So today I'll be giving you a relatively brief presentation, probably around 20 minutes or so. We'll have time for question and answer afterwards, but since we're such a small group, if you have a question in the middle of my presentation, feel free to just flag me down, unmute yourself or whatever, and happy to talk as you need, but we can certainly have more discussion at the very end. I will give an overview of what the problem of gun violence itself looks like and how it's very multifaceted in the ways that it impacts our communities. I will discuss some common misconceptions about gun violence and about Pennsylvania existing gun laws in particular. And I'll talk about some policy solutions and ways that you all can get involved. First off, just a little bit about CeaseFire. We are the leading gun violence prevention organization in Pennsylvania, working at the statewide level. There are certainly lots of groups working at the national level. You've probably heard of Everytown for Gun Safety, Brady, Giffords, just to name some of the more common, well-known ones. And then there's also lots of organizations working at the local community level. Here in Pittsburgh, kind of street violence intervention groups, all sorts of kind of social service organizations that work to prevent gun violence in one way or another. And we at CeaseFire kind of situated right in the middle, working at the state level. We are a policy-focused organization, so our ultimate goal is to pass policy in Harrisburg, but we also do education, so things just like today, just talking to people about gun violence, making sure people understand what the issue actually is, what the issues actually are. We do coalition building, so bringing all sorts of different groups together. The faith community is a huge part of our coalition. Civic groups, I was talking to a Rotary Club in Upper St. Clair a couple weeks ago. Medical professionals, trauma surgeons who directly see the effects of gun violence in their work. I'm very focused on growing this coalition and thinking about ways we can do that creatively in Western Pennsylvania. One example is veterans. As you may know, veteran suicide is a massive issue, nationally, close to 20 to 25 veterans every day commit suicide. And we'll talk about how suicide is such a major component of gun violence. And so I'm looking to bring veterans into the fold and get their voices heard in this issue as well. And then finally, the other part of our mission is advocacy to elected officials directly and helping connect people such as yourself to your elected officials. So what does gun violence look like in Pennsylvania? A lot of people would be surprised by this first chunk here, 62%. The majority of gun deaths in Pennsylvania and nationwide is actually suicide. Homicide accounts for about another third of that. And that other category of 3% is mostly mass shootings, but it also could include accidental shootings at home. So for example, if a child were to find an unsecured gun and either intentionally or unintentionally hurt themselves or kill themselves with that gun. And shootings by police are another kind of example of what would fit under that other category. But as you can see, gun violence, it's not a simple problem. It's very multifaceted, and it requires multifaceted solutions to address it. There's no one single policy we could pass, as much as I wish there was, that would significantly prevent or end gun violence. You need multiple strategies here to address the very complex way that gun violence manifests itself. First off, I'll start with homicides. Remember, homicides account for 35% of firearm deaths in Pennsylvania. And obviously the most important trend to note here is that the vast majority of homicides are committed by using the gun. Makes sense, guns are by far and away the most lethal weapon that one can access in a relatively easy manner. So it's very, very common for homicides to be used with a gun. Another point I'd flag here is that gun ownership actually doubles your risk of becoming the victim of a homicide. And this is a trend that we see throughout the gun violence prevention world. A lot of people will buy a gun or guns because to protect themselves for some against a home invasion, or especially in the midst of the pandemic and the racial justice movement that swept the country over the summer. We've seen a big uptick in people buying guns for self-protection. What we find in homicides and suicides and all sorts of manners, owning a gun actually puts you more at risk of being killed by a gun. So the common rationale of buying a gun to protect yourself, it's counterintuitive. You're actually putting yourself much more at risk of being killed by a gun, and that's true in homicide as well. The final point I raise here is that, and you probably would not be surprised to learn that being Black or Latino puts you at a greater risk of being killed by a gun in homicide, but you might be surprised at the extent to which that is true. 8 times, being Black or Latino makes you 8 times more likely to be killed by a gun. And a little snapshot of what we're looking at in terms of homicide in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County area. We're consistent entirely with the trends I just discussed. The city of Pittsburgh in 2020 had 44% of the county's 107 homicides. That is a disproportionate amount to the city's approximately 25% of the county's population. And the remaining homicides predominantly took place, the remaining homicides outside the city of Pittsburgh predominantly took place in communities that are majority minority. So Wilkinsburg, Duquesne, McKeesport, communities that are often majority Black are in our own very backyard here bearing the brunt of homicides. And I include this historical perspective to show that the problem of homicide in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County is, sadly, it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And that's true in a lot of places. You can see in 2019, we had 94 homicides, and in 2020, we had 107. Just in January and February of this year, 2021, we've already had 13 fatal shootings in Allegheny County. And actually, I believe that number is low. I've just been reading about, there's one, I think, in Stowe Township, a double homicide just a couple of days ago that I don't think has yet been captured in Allegheny County's data. So it's certainly a problem that is not going away. Another kind of subset of firearms homicides are domestic violence. And so when you think of a homicide with a gun, you probably will think of a poorly lit alleyway, in an inner city neighborhood, a mugging gone awry. But that certainly does not capture the entire picture. Domestic violence is a major cause of homicide by firearms. And just like I talked about with more traditional homicide, if there is a firearm in the house, a woman is 5 times more likely to be killed by their abuser than if there's not a firearm in the house. A little bit, and again, the data in Pennsylvania bears this out. Firearms account for the majority of Pennsylvania domestic violence deaths, both in 2018, the latest year when data is available, and over the past decade. So it's a pretty consistent trend. There is a bright spot here, though. The first gun violence prevention law that has been passed in Pennsylvania in the past 14 years has been passed on this subject. In 2019, Pennsylvania passed Act 79, which if an individual has a protection for abuse, a PFA order issued against them, their right to own a gun is temporarily restricted, and they are required to relinquish their weapons and their ammunition to law enforcement. There's been, excuse me, and just like with all sorts of laws, passing the law in and of itself is not the end game. We've seen just recently in Philadelphia, there is a incident where a woman had filed a protection from abuse order against her ex-husband and had called the police numerous times after he continued to threaten her with a gun. And for one reason or another, the gun was not removed from his possession, and he did end up killing her with the gun. So it's not just passing the law, it's making sure the law is implemented robustly. And so we still have progress to do there, but I want to acknowledge that reform and making progress on gun violence prevention, even in Pennsylvania, is definitely possible. We just did it a couple years ago, and we're really hoping to continue that momentum that was built from that into some of the other policies that we are proposing. Moving on to suicide, which, as you may remember from earlier, it's the majority of gun deaths. Fully 2/3 of gun deaths in Pennsylvania and across the country are suicides. And so really any kind of policy solution or any way to even think about gun violence, you need to put suicide, if not at the center, very close to it. And the toll is really simply staggering. 2 Pennsylvanians every single day on average take their lives with a gun. And it's a disproportionately effective way to commit suicide. And again, that makes sense. A gun is so much more lethal a mechanism than other types of ways to try to commit suicide, which are more often than you might think unsuccessful. And so 90% of people who try to commit suicide, if you look at their life, 90% of them do not end up dying by suicide. And so if you can remove the gun from that situation, and obviously, you want to have mental health counseling and supports to try and prevent people from getting to the point where they're suicidal. But if someone's reached that point where they've decided to try to commit suicide, if you can remove the gun from that situation, they're going to try some other means, less lethal means, hopefully be unsuccessful, and then we get them into supporting programming. But if they have a gun in their possession, they're very likely to be successful in that suicide attempt. You can see here, guns represent about 5% of suicide attempts, but fully half of the successful suicide deaths. So it really, really is important for people who are in that state of crisis. And it's not just people with documented mental health problems. All of us, any of us, can be in a state of crisis from at one point or another. And so finding a way to increase the safety there is something we're very focused on at CeaseFire. And again, a little snapshot of what suicide looks like in Allegheny County in Pennsylvania. Just like homicides, the problem is getting worse. In Allegheny County, and these numbers, it's a lot of statistics, but this is the rate of suicide per 100,000 people. And you can see it from 2014 to 2018, it's gotten a lot worse in Allegheny County. Statewide, we're seeing the same trend. It's even higher in neighboring counties that are, more economically depressed, experiencing more issues such as drug abuse, lack of opportunity, really hopelessness, and that really is an epidemic in and of itself, hopelessness. And suicide just continues to really plague us as an issue. As some context here for all these numbers, the Pennsylvania Department of Health has set a goal to get suicide statewide to 10.2 per 100,000 by the year 2020. Obviously, we have not succeeded in that. And so it really remains very important to find ways to prevent suicide, but prevent them from using a gun whenever we can. And moving on to the last major category of gun violence, and remember this is kind of that 3% other category, and it's mass shootings. And a lot of people are surprised that mass shootings represent comparatively such a small number of deaths and casualties. They capture the headline, they capture the national attention and conversation, as they should. They're horrific events, but when you're really looking objectively at the issue of gun violence, they are a relatively small component of deaths. That being said, Pennsylvania is not doing great on this measure either. There's a number of different ways to measure what a mass shooting is. There's no standard definition. There's a great database called the Gun Violence Archive, and they use the measure of 4 or more people injured, not necessarily killed, in a mass shooting, not including the shooter. And by that measure, we've had 101 shootings in Pennsylvania between 2013 and 2019. That's injured almost 500 people and killed almost 100 people. And so, based on my description, you can see that mass shootings are not just the horrific event like what we saw at the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018. They're more, I hate to say it, but day-to-day events. Just in Philadelphia this past week, you might have seen 8 people were shot. I believe 1 is still in critical condition. Luckily, it looks like nobody has died, but 8 people were shot on Broad Street, the main thoroughfare in Philadelphia, at a transit station. So this kind of violence is surprisingly common. Pennsylvania ranked 14th for mass shootings using these measurements. But the most important takeaway from this is that state law matters. And we see this across gun violence in general. A lot of people will try to tell you that, oh, well, criminals don't follow laws. What point is it to pass gun laws? But there's been really, really robust academic study of this, nonpartisan, non-political academic researchers who use data to look at this problem. And it's actually quite clear. We see that states with weaker gun laws have 63% more mass shootings than states with stronger gun laws. And Pennsylvania is not especially strong. We get a C+ ranking from Giffords, one of those national gun violence prevention groups that I talked about. And I can go into shortly, actually, you'll see some of the reasons why we get such a low ranking in terms of gun violence prevention. That being said, C+, there's other states who are worse than Pennsylvania, certainly, but we also definitely have lots of room to improve. Okay, well, that was a lot of information. It's still early in the morning. We're getting woken up, so I wanted to play a little game with you all, try and get you moving and thinking, to discuss some of what Pennsylvania's existing gun laws are before I get into some of the laws that we'd like to see. And this is always fun. People are surprised by this. So I thought we'd play some true or false. Just raise your hand if you think it's true or false. In Pennsylvania, someone can purchase 100 guns at a time if they want to. Who thinks that's true? Who thinks that's false? That is true. There is no legal limit whatsoever on the number of guns someone can buy at one time, and this raises a serious problem for straw purchasing, which is when someone who can pass a background check will buy guns with the intent of selling them to somebody else who cannot pass a background check. Often people with criminal records. So that's certainly something that we could make some progress on in Pennsylvania. Number 2, gun owners are legally required to report the loss or theft of their firearm. Who thinks that's true?
True, I think that's
What about false? Yep,
false.
unfortunately, that is false. There's no requirement to report it to law enforcement. You'd be surprised at how many guns are stolen in Pennsylvania. I'll get to it a little later on, but I think it's over 44,000 guns were stolen in a couple-year time frame just in Pennsylvania alone. And the problem, well, I'll get into this more in detail, but yeah, it seems pretty common sense that if you're a responsible gun owner and your gun is stolen, for example, out of your glove box in your car, which is pretty common or something, that you would want to report it first and foremost because you want to get your property back if the police locate your gun. But this gets into a whole network of criminal activity that we will discuss a little later. Number 3, municipalities can establish their own gun violence prevention laws. I think that's true in Pennsylvania.
I think that's true. I think it's true.
And what about false? Sad to say that one's false as well. This is a legal principle called preemption, where states, and it can happen across multiple policy areas, not just guns. For example, Pennsylvania does not allow local governments to ban plastic bags, trying to be environmentally friendly. So all sorts of kind of random policy areas, preemption, this legal principle where states prohibit local governments from passing laws that go stronger than what the state law allows for. We saw this in Pittsburgh directly here after the synagogue shooting in 2018. Pittsburgh passed multiple gun violence prevention laws. They knew that this would happen. They were immediately sued by the NRA. And those laws are still tied up in court under this preemption law. And just as an aside, CeaseFire is working on this issue. There's legislation that is coming forward in Pennsylvania that would make a specific carve out in the preemption laws to allow local governments to ban guns in municipal buildings. This is a push that we picked up after the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C. It's surprisingly common actually in Pennsylvania. It's happened multiple times when somebody with, some kind of really small grievance against the municipal government, like a sewer fee dispute or something, will barge into a local government center and end up killing local government employees. So currently, local governments are not even allowed to ban firearms in their own facilities, in their own parks, other government spaces, and so we're working on trying to allow that. There is also a lawsuit that we are a part of that is challenging the constitutionality of the entire preemption law regarding guns in Pennsylvania. It's a novel legal concept, legal argument. So it's probably going to take a couple of years to play out in court. But essentially, what we're arguing is that if the state refuses to act to protect people, they are directly violating Pennsylvanians' constitutional right to life, and then it will be unconstitutional for them to bar local governments from taking action that the state is not willing or able to take. Next one here, firearm trading is required when you purchase a gun in Pennsylvania. Who thinks that's true? And what about false? I think you guys are picking up on the trend here that the answer is almost always the sad one. Yes, that is false. Literally you got to go through a driving training course to get a driver's license, all sorts of training courses for all sorts of things that impact the public and the public good, but not true with the firearm. No training whatsoever required in Pennsylvania. Okay, so we have talked about the problem, and I hope I haven't depressed you thoroughly, but I want to make sure to include an optimistic part of the presentation, and that is kind of the things that we are working towards. And I've been in the gun violence prevention space for a little over a month now, and I'm still frankly learning about all the different types of policies that could be put in place to prevent needless gun deaths. Academic research and other states and countries, for that matter, have had a lot of success in showing that specific policies can save lives, and they can do so without even coming close to being to posing constitutionality problems with the Second Amendment. We have at CeaseFire selected 3 policies that we're calling our common agenda. And these are, in the past, have had bipartisan support. They've got very high support among the public. And given the, we've got to be realistic about the political landscape as it is in Harrisburg. And that's for a whole conversation for another day about gerrymandering and all that kind of stuff. But the General Assembly is controlled by the Republican Party, and we need to try and find solutions that can move forward in that political context. So we've identified 3 here that I can go into more detail. That is comprehensive background checks, extreme risk protection orders, and requiring the reporting of lost and stolen firearms. The first, comprehensive background checks. If you've had, if you've at all followed the gun violence political discussion in America, I'm sure you've heard of comprehensive background checks. They are extremely popular. 88% of Americans, including gun owners, support them. And in Pennsylvania, what universal background checks means is something very specific. We actually have a relatively good background check system in Pennsylvania. The FBI at the national level operates NICS, which is the National Instant Check System. We in Pennsylvania have a parallel system called PICS, the Pennsylvania Instant Check System, which is run by the state police. And in Pennsylvania, background checks are required for multiple different types of gun sales. If you are a federally licensed dealer, any gun sale you do requires a background check. And if you're a private seller selling handguns, that requires background checks. But the big loophole that we want to close is this specific one, the private sale of long guns. And long guns, it's not meant to be a deceptive phrase. It's literally any gun with a longer barrel, ranging from grandpa's hunting rifle passed down to you to a semi-automatic AR-15 rifle used in a lot of mass shootings. So a lot of these guns that are sold privately end up being used in mass shootings in Pennsylvania, in police shootouts, killing police officers, injuring them. And these guns, by their nature, can be extremely dangerous. A lot of them are military-style weapons. And at the moment, as long as it's sold by a private seller, there's no need for a background check. And so there's legislation that would close this loophole, Senate Bill 88 and House Bill 673, and it would prevent these kinds of guns from getting in the hands of people who, literally, we already agree shouldn't have these kinds of guns as long as they're sold by a licensed dealer. So there's really no internal logic. The state law already says, there's this group of people who shouldn't have access to firearms. Well, except in this one case, they can have access as long as it's private sale of long guns. So it's kind of a crazy loophole that we'd like to close. And in our conversations with state legislators, we're in a new session this year. The General Assembly in Harrisburg works in 2-year sessions. So we've just started a new 2-year session. And this policy, universal background checks, has been identified as one of the most likely, if not the most likely, policies to pass. And it would save lives, absolutely. We've seen in other states that have this policy on books, we see less mass shootings, we see lower rates of homicides. The second main policy that we are pushing for are extreme risk protection orders, ERPOs, sometimes called red flag laws. And this was also a major topic of discussion, especially after the Parkland shooting in Florida. What this would do is create a legal civil process through which a family member or a law enforcement officer, if they notice someone who is presenting concerning signs, that they believe they could be at imminent risk of hurting themselves or someone else with a gun, they can initiate a civil process through a court to essentially go through a court case. And the legislation here in Pennsylvania has very strong due process legal protections for the individual with the firearm to make sure that their rights are being protected and that there is a due process to this. But once it goes through that due process, if a judge determines that that individual is an imminent risk to themselves or others, they will have a 1-year ERPO, extreme risk protection order, placed on them. And they would be required to relinquish their firearms and ammunition for 1 year. The individual who has this order placed on them at any point can appeal it, can go through a legal process. They have legal representation. And then after 1 year, the order would expire. The order could be reinstated again, but they'd have to go through the whole legal process again. So it's been shown in 19 states and the District of Columbia. It's already been passed and implemented there. And it's been shown to be very, very effective at reducing suicide. Connecticut was the first state to pass this back in 1999, or even 1995, even earlier. And we've seen a 13.7% decline in suicide, which is pretty massive. Indiana, also a very red state, passed this law, and they saw a 7.5% decline in suicide. And as similar with mass shootings as well. The FBI has shown that with a lot of mass shootings, the individual who commits those crimes very often has multiple instances of concerning behaviors, often 4 or 5 times. They've observed to family, to a teacher, to a mentor, to somebody, they observe something concerning. And each one of those chances is an opportunity for this ERPO process to be used. And again, we saw this directly in Florida with the Parkland shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. The shooter there had literally posted on social media that he wanted or thought about going to shoot up a school. The police had visited his house multiple times, but they had no legal mechanism to disarm him and to have him essentially disarm himself. And so, we saw the results of that. And similarly in California, you can see a number of people showed clear signs that they were potential at risk of committing some kind of horrific act. And after the ERPO law is implemented, those guns were temporarily removed. Obviously, they did not have a chance to commit that kind of mass killing. So this is, we're really excited about this as an opportunity to really strike a balance between acknowledging and protecting people's legitimate rights under the Second Amendment. CeaseFire is not an organization that's advocating for abolishing the Second Amendment or confiscating all firearms. We're not opposed to guns. We're opposed to gun violence and people using guns to kill each other. So this is a terrific way in terms of to strike that right balance between individuals' rights and individual and public safety. Moving on to the third and final core policy that CeaseFire is advocating for. Remember, we spoke earlier about how in Pennsylvania, individuals are not required to report when their gun is lost or stolen. Over 43,000 guns were stolen in Pennsylvania alone between 2012 and 2017. Nationally, it's over 380,000. I've seen estimates as high as 500,000. And the issue here becomes when a gun is lost or stolen, it often ends up being used in a crime. In Pittsburgh alone, there was a study done that saw a third of the guns recovered at crime scenes were said to have been lost or stolen. And the problem when it's not required that you report a lost and stolen firearm, when police find a gun at the crime scene, they can trace it back to who bought the gun. There's often a background check or some record of sale they can go back to see who initially had that gun in their possession. They can say, "Oh, I didn't know it was stolen," which is a very, very common argument and consequence-free under current state law. They can say, "I didn't know it was stolen," and there's no legal mechanism for police to hold people accountable. And I want to be clear, I'm not necessarily criticizing the responsible gun owner who had their gun stolen and maybe legitimately didn't know about it. But what this would do is by putting this law on the books, it gives law enforcement just another way to hold bad actors accountable, people who are intentionally engaging in those straw purchases, buying 100 guns at a time and then selling them off. And then they could just say it was lost or stolen without any consequence. gun trafficking rings. There was a big example of one of these gun trafficking rings broken up in the Philadelphia area just this past week. And so by requiring the reporting of lost and stolen firearms, it's a lot more information and data and insight to law enforcement about what guns are on the street, how they're getting there, the route that these guns travel, and it helps law enforcement to interrupt these straw purchasing and gun trafficking operations. And again, you speak to most responsible gun owners, and most of them would say, yeah, of course, if my gun was stolen, I'd want to report it so I can get the gun back. But it also has the benefit of really aiding these law enforcement efforts. Katrina, do you have a question?
Yeah, so what kind of pushback are you getting about this? Like who is it that is arguing that we should not have to report lost or stolen guns, and what arguments are they using?
The most common one that I hear is it's more like a convenience, argument. Like, well, I don't want to be required to do it. I'm like, what if I legitimately didn't know it was lost, and then I'm gonna be the one held, punished because it was just an honest mistake. And I think, like most laws, you put a law in the books, but the actual implementation of it, there's law enforcement, there's prosecutors who are involved in this, and you speak to most law enforcement and prosecutors, and they're not interested in prosecuting someone for an honest mistake. They're interested in using this law to hold criminals accountable. So the most common argument that I hear is, I don't want to be at risk of being criminally prosecuted for what could be an honest mistake, and I don't want to be required to report it within a certain time frame. The legislation, there's different kinds of bills. One says 72 hours from the moment you realize it's lost. One says 24 hours. I hear that, but more often I hear from gun owners, this makes sense.
Okay. I mean, is it like do you think that, I don't know, what's the timeline for sort of like getting these kinds of policies implemented? Like, how long does that take?
Well, once the law is passed, it can, oftentimes there's like a couple month delay between when the law is passed and when it takes effect. But first we need to get the law passed. We are in a 2-year session right now, so we've got 2 years pretty much to pass this law when the clock resets. I'll be candid with you. We're having difficulty convincing lawmakers to make this particular one a priority. Which is unfortunate because it just seems so blatantly common sense. So it might be a little while until we see this law in the books, but we're definitely going to keep pushing for it. Does that answers your question? Terrific. Thank you for that question, by the way. Okay. Yeah. So I was there's legislation that was introduced last session that will require that a gun be reported within 3 days from when it was missing. So that's something that will, that's a response that I'll give to a gun owner who says, oh, I'm worried about this. Well, that's only from when you realize that the gun was lost. So that's when the actual clock starts. There's another bill that would be 24 hours. It's a little more strict. And the intention really is just, again, not to punish people for honest mistakes, but to create a legal mechanism to hold people accountable who are knowingly abusing this loophole in the law as an excuse. And if you talk to Pittsburgh police investigators, they hear every single day, I didn't know the gun was stolen. And how likely is that? In some cases maybe, but most people who have a gun know where it is. They probably check on it pretty frequently and would notice that it's lost within a pretty short amount of time. And so just another final point I make here is, this really incentivizes and encourages responsible gun ownership, which we are fully for. And it would actually, of all the 3 policies we've discussed, this could potentially have the biggest impact on reducing violent crime, especially homicides, because so many of these guns end up being used and linked to crime scenes. So what can you do to help? If you're part of the 64% of Pennsylvania registered voters who support laws that regulate gun ownership, according to a recent poll, there's a lot of things you can do. And Lori Swenson, the chair of the Gun Safety Committee, I believe will be talking a little bit more about this today at your service. And I'll go ahead and drop these links in the chat as well. But for our common agenda, those 3 policies that we discussed, we have a petition that we would love to get your signature on if you're interested. We are hosting a March 23rd virtual advocacy day this year. We've done this every year. It's been in person. We get people on a bus to Harrisburg. Obviously this year, we can't do that to be safe and responsible. So we're doing it by Zoom. And we're actually excited because I think this could create an opportunity for a lot more people to get involved in Advocacy Day. You don't have to use your whole day going to Harrisburg. You can just take an hour or so off work if you're working from home. And that'll be meetings directly with lawmakers to advocate for these policies. We're going to have a rally, hopefully get some the Attorney General, the governor, or other elected officials involved. We're still organizing that. But we'd love to get you registered for Advocacy Day. I will post the link where you can do that. If you're interested in just keeping more up to date on what CeaseFire is working on, you can text CFPA to 72572 to get text alerts. You can visit our website, ceasefirepa.org, and subscribe to our email alerts. We'll let you know when there's legislation coming up where your voice could make an impact in terms of advocacy. And there's all sorts of other things you could do. You could write an op-ed or letter to the editor. If you're interested in doing that, I'm certainly very happy to work with you on that. And really fundamentally, I think on this issue in particular, just having conversations with family, friends, and neighbors. Admittedly, we in the city of Pittsburgh and Squirrel Hill live in a little bit of a bubble. I think more people than not would share my point of view on the issue of gun violence and gun regulation. But if you have family in parts of the county or the state that are a little more conservative, talk to them about the issue, encouraging them to call their lawmakers, email their lawmakers, let them know that this is a priority for them. It makes a difference. I was really intentional to mention earlier how we have passed a law just recently that protects people who are abused from those who have a gun. And so, we've shown that progress can be made in Pennsylvania. I'll be honest with you, it's going to be a long, hard push. Anything that is worth doing is difficult. We certainly face an organized and outspoken opposition, but I have, in my work with Senator Iovino and my work since then with CeaseFire, I've really seen firsthand how there is a really strong growing movement for gun violence prevention, and not just in the city and the places where you think it would be, in the suburbs and the exurbs, even in the rural area. I think people are seeing how suicides and the way gun violence is really tearing communities apart, tearing families apart, and I think people are increasingly calling for action. So I encourage you to join our fight, stick with us. If you have any questions about how to get involved, please let me know. And I also wanted to mention about this. So if you do talk with friends or family, always start with the problem, just like I did today, to frame the issue that is plaguing so many communities. Try to make it personal. Sadly, it's not that hard to find examples of gun violence recently in your community that you can cite as examples. And especially this bullet right here, very important, at least from the way that we approach it. We're not here to take your guns away. We're here to make our community safer. And that's really what it's all about, is making people safe, preventing needless deaths from happening. So I am more than happy to, and here's CeaseFire's information. If you're interested, you can follow us on social media, visit our website, send us an email. And here's my particular contact information. Happy to take any questions, or if anybody wants to share anything, have any discussion. I think we have till 10:45, so we've got about 10 minutes if anybody is interested.
I have a question. What other organizations are you in coalition with or in conversation with so that these efforts can be spread. I mean, I know there's a Squirrel Hill group against gun violence, and I know the League of Women Voters has a gun violence committee as well. And I would think the AAUW would, and the Urban League, and all kinds. There's so many people working on this. How do you garner all of that support to be maximally influential?
Good question. Thank you. So we kind of one of the main pillars of our work at CeaseFire is coalition building. So it's bringing people together around this common cause. For this particular common agenda coalition, we've got over 100 different organizations and leadership individuals already signed on, and it's growing. A lot of them are faith communities, civic groups, organizations that are explicitly about gun violence, medical professionals, as I mentioned, veterans. I want to do a better job of engaging with school space, education professionals. Labor unions are another place I'm interested in exploring. The teachers union, the transit union, people who bear, who are threatened by guns almost every single day across this country. Getting them involved in the fight for safer workspaces. I think because this issue is because gun violence affects so many people in so many places, the opportunity for a really broad coalition is there, and we've got a great basis for that, and continue to build on that. But to go into a little more detail, we've got we have this coalition that we meet with once or twice a month. We are working with individuals to write op-eds and letters to the editor, to coordinate outreach to elected officials, with a focus on geographic spread, because as we do kind of live in that echo chamber here in these more liberal bubbles. So we really want to make sure that we are finding people, and there are plenty of people who live in ruby red legislative districts who believe very strongly in gun violence prevention. So finding those people, bringing them into the fold, tapping into the different organizations and networks that already exist out there. We've built a strong foundation, and it's only getting stronger.